Walk past the London Stock Exchange this summer, and the screens tell a triumphant story. The FTSE 100 has spent 2026 brushing record highs. And it's a lie. Well, not quite a lie. A flattering half-truth. Because most of those blue-chip giants don't really earn their living in Britain at all. They're oil majors and miners that bank their profits in dollars. Strip them out, look at the Britain that actually trades with its neighbors, makes things, hires people, and a very different picture comes into focus. Here's what nobody tells you about an economy going wrong. We imagine it as an explosion, a crash. One terrible morning, queues outside the banks, a number on a screen falling off a cliff. Brexit was never going to look like that. 10 years on, it looks like a slow puncture. No blowout, no bang, just a steady hiss of pressure leaking out year after year until the car is sitting lower on the road than it should, and everyone's grown so used to the ride, they've stopped noticing. So here's the question for today. If a country can be made measurably poorer with no single dramatic moment to point to, how would you ever prove it happened? 10 years on from the referendum, the argument about Brexit has finally changed. It has moved from prophecy to forensics. This is the story of a slow subtraction. You're listening to the Veritas Brief, the podcast from Veritas Europaea, slow journalism for people who'd rather understand the world than simply react to it. We follow the money, we read the footnotes, and we try very hard not to tell you what you already want to hear. Today, Brexit at 10, and the quiet arithmetic of a bill that's still being paid. Let's start with the figure, because the first honest thing to say is that there isn't one, and there never will be. You cannot rerun the last 10 years with the referendum reversed. So every estimate of Brexit's cost rests on a counterfactual, a kind of statistical ghost of the Britain that voted Remain. And researchers conjure that ghost in different ways, which is exactly why their numbers disagree. The Office for Budget Responsibility, that's the government's own fiscal watchdog, not some Brussels think tank, has held to one assumption since 2020, that swapping the single market for the looser trade deal we ended up with will cut Britain's long-run productivity by 4%. Now, 4% doesn't sound like much, but 4% of an economy approaching £3 trillion is output lower by roughly £125 billion a year, and tax revenues lighter by something close to £50 billion. Every single year. And the newer research points higher. Nicholas Bloom at Stanford and his colleagues tracked Britain against a basket of comparable economies and concluded that by 2025, Brexit had shrunk UK GDP by 6 to 8%. Goldman Sachs, with its rather grimly named doppelganger model, lands around 6. The National Institute puts it at 5 to 6. The more cautious Center for European Reform says 2 to 3. And Bloomberg Economics frames the whole thing in pounds, a persistent drag worth somewhere between $100 billion and more than $200 billion a year. Now, that spread looks damning. How can serious people be that far apart? But once you understand why they disagree, it actually tells you something. The lower numbers measure the damage that's already visible. The higher ones project where the slow burn is heading, because the OBR itself assumes the full effect takes 15 years to land. We are not at the end of this. We are in the middle of it. And here's what every credible study now shares, the two things they all agree on. 1. The sign is negative. And 2. The effect doesn't go away. So why has it been so easy to ignore? Cast your mind back to 2016. The Leave campaign's opponents predicted catastrophe, recession the morning after the vote, a collapsing housing market, instant capital flight. And none of it arrived on schedule. Leave supporters have spent 10 years pointing that out. And you know what? They're right. They're right about the timing. They're just wrong about the lesson. Because Brexit was never going to detonate. Trade with Europe didn't stop. It thickened with friction. Investment didn't vanish. It quietly went somewhere else. Jonathan Portis, of UK in a Changing Europe, put it better than any single statistic. He calls it a gradual and cumulative drag on trade, on investment, on productivity. The economy didn't fall off a cliff. It just started walking up a slightly steeper hill, and it has been walking up that hill ever since. Here's the mechanism in one sentence. Brexit didn't detonate. It introduced a small, permanent tax on almost everything Britain does with its largest market. And small, Permanent taxes compound. And that is precisely what makes the cost so easy to dismiss and so painfully hard to reverse. A one-off disaster leaves a scar everyone can point to. A compounding drag leaves only a counterfactual, the richer Britain that never got built. And voters do not miss income they never received. They just find, year after year, that the public finances feel a little tighter, that the pay packet stretches a little less far, that every chancellor's choices have narrowed by a margin nobody can quite name. That's the trap. A crash forces a reckoning. A slow subtraction just invites a shrug. So where does the drag actually bite? Start with trade, the channel the textbooks flagged first. The deal Britain struck spared most goods from tariffs. That part worked. But it stripped away everything that made commerce frictionless. The automatic recognition, the absence of customs checks, the right to just move goods without paperwork. And in their place came rules of origin requirements, sanitary certificates, declarations, inspections, 1,000 small frictions, each one costing time and money. The numbers followed. Researchers studying the deal's first 2 years found UK exports down more than 6%, imports down over 4%, with the smallest firms hit hardest. Many of them simply gave up on EU trade altogether because they couldn't carry the admin. And let me give you the one example that does the work of 100 charts. Bosch, the German engineering group. Its UK arm now processes roughly 10,000 import transactions a year. Before Brexit, that figure was about 40. They now employ nearly a dozen people in a department that exists for one reason: to move paper that the single market used to make unnecessary. Now Bosch could absorb that. It stayed. But think about the thousands of smaller British firms that don't have a customs department to spare. They didn't stay. They just stopped. I want to be fair here, because honesty demands it, and services complicate the picture. Britain's service exports, the consulting, the research, the advertising, all the things that travel down a fiber optic cable instead of through a port, those have actually kept growing, even into the EU. Only about a third of our service exports go to the bloc, and customs posts don't bother a data file. So the services story is mostly one of resilience. Financial services fared worse. But the goods story is the hard one. Trade grabs the headlines, but investment may matter more, and it works more silently still. Think about what unbuilt investment actually looks like. A factory a firm never builds. A production line it never automates. A British site quietly passed over for a German or a Polish one. None of these register as a loss. They register as nothing at all. There's no headline, no closing ceremony, no redundancy notice. And yet over a decade, the absence of that capital becomes the difference between an economy that grows and one that merely persists. And the evidence here has hardened. Researchers at King's Business School concluded, late last year, that Brexit left UK business investment as much as 18% lower than it would otherwise have been. The single hardest hit channel in their whole analysis. Even before the pandemic, business investment was already 16% below the path forecasters had expected. Uncertainty did the early damage. Firms simply froze, postponing decisions while the shape of the future stayed unknown. And here's the cruel part. This kind of loss compounds twice. The missing capital lowers output today, and the productivity gains that capital would have delivered lower output for years afterwards. That's how a one-off political choice becomes a permanent feature of the growth rate. Let me put the whole ledger on the table quickly. Output, 6 to 8% smaller. Business investment, down as much as 18%. Goods trade, assumed 15% below where membership would have left it. The pound, down 12% against the euro. And cumulative outflows from UK equity funds, money that has voted with its feet, roughly $160 billion. Hold that last number, we're coming back to it. Quick pause. If you've made it this far, you already know the kind of work this is. Slow, sourced, and unafraid to give the other side a hearing. Here's the thing. Veritas Europaea has no advertisers buying your attention, and no billionaire backer steering the line. There's a certain irony in saying that on an ad break, but this is the ad. It's reader-funded, and it stays that way for a reason. €2 a week, that's it. That's what keeps the lights on, keeps the analysis independent, and keeps it free of the gatekeepers who decide what you're allowed to read. If this episode was worth your time, become a member at veritaseuropaea.eu. That's Veritas-Europea-.-E-U. €2 a week buys you the full archive, the long reads behind these episodes, and the quiet satisfaction of paying for journalism that works for you and not for someone else. Right, back to Britain. Currencies don't wait for the studies. They render their verdict in real time, and the pound delivered its verdict within hours of the result. And it has never fully recovered. Sterling trades roughly 10% below its pre-referendum level against the dollar, and about 12% lower against the euro. On the eve of the vote, a pound bought you €1.31. Today it buys around $1.15. The single currency Britain chose to leave has, in effect, quietly bought back 12% of British purchasing power. And for a country that imports much of its food, its energy, its raw materials, a weaker pound is not an abstraction. It feeds straight into the cost of living. Every imported good gets dearer. It gave the post-Brexit inflation surge an extra, homegrown twist. Yes, a weaker pound can flatter exporters, and to a degree it has. But Britain mostly buys what it cannot make. So the currency, on balance, has cut against households far more than it's helped factories. Now, here's the part that I suspect will land differently for those of us listening from this side of the continent. The pound's sharpest losses aren't against the dollar or the euro at all. Sterling has fallen more than 20% against the Czech koruna, 13% against the Polish zloty. And that is not a coincidence. These are precisely the economies that have spent the decade drawing in the manufacturing capacity and the foreign investment that in another timeline might have flowed to Birmingham or Sunderland. The pound didn't just weaken, it weakened most against the neighbors best placed to take what Britain gave up. So now come back to that record-breaking FTSE, because the paradox finally resolves into a warning. Morningstar's Decade Review is bluntly titled The Brexit Decade, and it lays out the structural retreat hiding underneath the cheerful headline. Remember that $160 billion? That's how much UK equity funds have bled in net outflows since the vote. 6 straight years of investors heading for the door. That's not a cyclical wobble anymore. That's a settled loss of confidence. And the reason is the performance gap, which is brutal. Since the referendum, the FTSE 100 is up about 62%, a compound return just under 5% a year. Over the very same stretch, the S&P 500 climbed roughly 253%, nearly 3 times the pace. Global Money noticed. In the most aggressive UK funds Morningstar tracks, the average British weighting has collapsed from 40% down to 18%, and most of that freed up capital went straight to America. Britain's share of the main global equity index has roughly halved over 2 decades, from near 10% to about 4%. Here's the line I keep coming back to. A market can hit record highs and quietly lose its place in the world at the same time. London hasn't stopped being a financial center. It has simply started shrinking as one, relative to the rivals it used to lead. Now, I've spent 12 minutes building a fairly grim case. So let me do the thing this show exists to do and turn that case on itself. Because a serious body of opinion disputes almost everything I've just told you, and they are not cranks. The skeptics, at Briefings for Britain, at the Institute of Economic Affairs, go after the foundation, that official 4% productivity figure. They argue it rests on a chain of contestable assumptions. The link from trade openness to productivity, they point out, draws much of its statistical force from developing economies opening up, which may map very poorly onto a mature service economy like Britain's. They note that the OBR itself once catalogued these very doubts before adopting the number anyway. And then they reach for the data, with a genuinely awkward question. British manufacturing, the sector most exposed to EU trade, has actually raised its productivity sharply since 2016. Meanwhile, the heaviest drag on national productivity has come from the public sector, which barely trades with anyone. So if Brexit is supposedly strangling productivity through trade, why is the least Brexit-exposed corner of the economy the one dragging the average down? It's a fair question, and it deserves a better answer than a shrug. Even some who accept a cost think it's been overstated. Julian Jessup, a Leave-supporting economist, concedes there was real early damage, but argues it came in smaller than the gloomiest forecasts and should fade as firms adapt. So where does that leave us, honestly? It leaves us here. The dissent doesn't overturn the weight of evidence. The macro models, the firm surveys, the synthetic control studies still converge on a negative number, And Michael Saunders, formerly of the Bank of England, speaks for the mainstream when he calls Brexit a constant drag on the economy. But the dissent performs a real service. It exposes just how much rests on assumption rather than observation. The truthful summary is not that Brexit cost exactly X, it's that nearly every serious attempt to measure it lands on the same side of zero. So is anyone trying to fix it? Gingerly, yes. The Lancaster House Summit of May last year marked the first real thaw, a Labour government and Brussels finally back at the table. Out of it came a clutch of small, targeted deals, cutting the paperwork on food and farm trade, linking the two carbon trading systems, a youth mobility scheme carefully named to avoid the words free movement, and a return to the Erasmus exchange program. Each one helps at the margin. None of them comes close to reversing the decade. The Prime Minister claimed the package might add £9 billion a year by 2040, and you should set that $9 billion against the hundreds of billions the same economy is foregoing every year on the higher estimates. A House of Lords committee surveyed all the work still left undone and gave its report the dry, perfect title, Unfinished Business. Because the real prize stays locked behind a political red line. Economists point to one change that could genuinely move the dial, both sides simply agreeing to trust each other's product certificates. That alone could lift UK goods exports to the EU by something like 10%. But reaching it would mean Britain aligning with EU rules in exchange for access, which is the precise trade-off the 2016 vote was fought to avoid. Until a government is willing to reopen that bargain, the reset can only ever nibble at the edges. And politically, there's a twin to all this, and it has been anything but slow. Since 2016, Britain has burned through prime ministers at a pace with no modern precedent. None has lasted longer than 3 years. One survived 49 days. This very summer brought the latest convulsion, a Labour leadership crisis barely a year into government. That instability isn't a sideshow to the economics, it compounds them. Investment craves predictability, and a country that changes its leader and its economic direction every couple of years offers the exact opposite. And yet, here's the strange part. Almost no senior figure in business or politics now argues for rejoining. The issue's too raw, the prospect too exhausting, and the firms that spent a decade adapting have no appetite to do it all over again. Britain has settled into a peculiar equilibrium, broadly agreed that Brexit has cost it, and broadly unwilling to undo it. So step back. Step all the way back, and the shape of the thing finally comes clear. Brexit did not crash the British economy. It repriced it. It put a modest, permanent tax on trade with Britain's biggest market. It deterred a decade of investment. It knocked a slice off the pound. And it quietly demoted London in the league table of global markets. Each one of those, on its own, looks survivable. But together, compounding year on year, they add up to a structurally smaller, slower-growing economy than the one that walked into the polling booth in 2016. And the markets have now largely priced that discount as permanent. The honest caveats still stand. The estimates span a wide range, untangling Brexit from a pandemic, an energy shock, and a war on Europe's border defeats precise attribution. And a determined band of economists still disputes the headline. But the direction of travel hasn't been in serious doubt for years. So the question for the next 10 years is no longer whether Brexit carried a cost. It's whether Britain keeps paying that cost in full, claws back a fraction through a cautious reset, or eventually decides the whole bargain is worth revisiting. And on the current trajectory, the most likely answer is the first. A country that has quietly accepted a smaller future as the price of a choice it is no longer willing to argue about. The puncture has stopped hissing. The tire is simply flat. And Britain has learned to drive on it. That's it for this episode of the Veritas Brief. The full long read, with every source, chart, and figure laid out, is waiting for you at veritaseuropea.eu. If it was worth your time, the best thing you can do is share it with one person who'd argue with it. This show is reader-funded. €2 a week, no gatekeepers, no advertisers picking the topics. If you want more of it, become a member at the site, and follow the podcast wherever you're listening right now so the next one finds you automatically. This has been the Veritas Brief. Read carefully, think slowly.